They say she smiled. They say she joked. That she wore a cloak of composure so seamless, not even death could unravel it. But what they don't say, what they don't want to say, is that on the morning of May 19th, 1536, beneath the grey, godless sky that loomed over the Tower of London, Anne Boleyn knew, she knew there would be no reprieve, no royal pardon, no last-minute miracle. She was 35 years old, a queen, a mother, a lover, and in a matter of moments, she would be nothing more than a severed memory, scattered like dust across the cobblestones of Tower Green. The fog was thick that morning, chilling and still. The birds had gone quiet. The whispers of courtiers, once cruel and gleeful, were now muted by something heavier, guilt, or fear, or the unsettling realization that the same crown that made her was the blade that would unmake her. They say she walked with grace, that her back was straight, that her eyes were calm, as if she had already made peace with the executioner. But look closer, closer than the record dares, and you'll find the flicker of a woman not surrendering, but resisting, not praying for heaven, but cursing the silence of it. The scaffold loomed like a sacrificial altar. Her enemies waited in shadowed balconies, and the man with the sword, the hired ghost from France, stood silently behind her, his blade concealed, his heart untouched. And Boleyn knelt in the cold, damp morning, no priest by her side, no husband to plead for her soul, just wind, stone, and the watchful eyes of a nation that had once called her whore, then queen, and now nothing at all. She whispered her final words. No curses, no screams, only grace, only fire, only truth too dangerous to survive. Then the sword came down, fast, clean, without warning. They say her lips moved after the blade struck, that her soul didn't leave quietly, that part of her stayed behind, in the silence that followed, a silence so complete, it swallowed history itself. But this is not just the story of Anne Boleyn's death. It's the story of power, betrayal, and a queen who died with more dignity than any of the men who condemned her. Before she wore the crown, she was merely a name whispered in foreign courts. Anne Boleyn, not born to rule, not groomed for power, but she carried something far more dangerous than royal blood. She carried vision, and charm, and a mind sharp enough to draw the eye of a king and the envy of a court. She arrived in the English court not as a noble's daughter to be married off, but as a lady-in-waiting, first to Margaret of Austria, then to Queen Claude of France, and eventually to Queen Catherine of Aragon. It was there, amid the tapestry of royalty and ambition, that Anne learned the rules of the game, and how to break them. She was unlike any woman Henry VIII had ever known. Educated, fierce, fluent in French and theology. She debated scripture with bishops. She wore French fashion that revealed a little too much. She refused to be his mistress. She made him wait, and the more she refused, the deeper he fell. Henry VIII was not used to being denied. Kings rarely are. And so, the chase became a war against law, against Rome, against God himself. For Anne, he tore the world apart. 7 years of courtship, 7 years of Henry writing letters, longing, aching, begging, until finally, in 1533, the impossible became reality. Henry broke from the Pope. The Church of England was born, and Anne was crowned queen. But a crown earned by fire is never worn in peace. All eyes turned to her womb, and Boleyn was no longer simply a queen, she was a vessel. Her purpose now reduced to one act, to give the king a son. In September of that year she gave birth not to a prince but to a daughter, Elizabeth, a girl with fire in her eyes, and a future no one could yet imagine. The years that followed were haunted by disappointment, miscarriages, rumors of deformity. The whispers grew louder, that Anne had bewitched the king, that her womb was cursed, that God had turned his face from her. Henry began to drift, and once his obsession became a thorn. Her sharp tongue, once adored, was now a liability. She had made enemies, powerful men who waited patiently for her fall. Chief among them, Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell, the king's architect of power, saw and not as a queen, but as an obstacle. Her reformist beliefs threatened his alliances. Her influence over the king, once mighty, was waning, and so he began to move, in silence, in shadows. He didn't need to prove she was guilty. He only needed to convince the king she was. In a court where whispers held more power than truth, Anne's fate was sealed not by evidence, but by envy. And so the queen became the quarry. The trap had been set. The clock had begun to tick. And Anne Boleyn, the woman who had changed the world, was about to become its most elegant sacrifice. It began not with thunder, but with a knock. May 2nd, 1536. The Queen of England was called to appear before the King's Privy Council, an unusual summons, even for a monarch's wife. But Anne Boleyn, ever poised, obeyed. She may have known, deep down, behind the layers of royal dignity and courtly rituals, she may have already felt it coming. The eyes that no longer met hers, the silence in Henry's chambers, the absence of music, of laughter, of hope. When she entered the council chamber, she found no king, only men. Men who once bowed before her now stood stiff, accusing. She was told plainly, coldly, formally, she was under arrest. The charges: adultery, with 5 men, commoners, musicians, and courtiers alike, including her own brother, George Boleyn. Incest, treason. The words struck like ice water. They weren't just lies, they were impossibilities. And yet, they were spoken as truth, written in ink, approved by her king, her husband, and denied it. Of course she denied it. But in Tudor England, denial was a whisper against a storm. Evidence was never needed, only suspicion, only politics, only fear. They say she laughed, a sharp, disbelieving laugh, edged with hysteria, not from amusement, but from the sheer madness of it all. By nightfall, she was taken from Greenwich to the Tower of London by barge. The same river that had brought her to coronation now carried her to ruin. As she stepped off the barge, she paused. This was not her first time at the Tower. 3 years earlier, she had entered through these very gates to prepare for her coronation. Crowds had cheered. Trumpets had sung. Now only silence met her. The lieutenant of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, received her. She asked one question, her voice cracking under the weight of dread. "Shall I go to a dungeon?" Kingston replied, "No, madam, you shall go to the lodging you had before your coronation." It was meant as a kindness, felt like cruelty. In that room, once adorned with silks and jewels, now stripped and lifeless, and unraveled. She wept, she prayed, she questioned. Over and over again, she repeated one phrase to Lady Kingston. "Why am I here? What have I done?" Her voice was raw, her eyes wide and red. Her hands trembled as she grasped at reason, like a drowning woman reaching for air. But reason had left the palace long ago, replaced by hunger, male ambition, and a king who now gazed at another woman, Jane Seymour, as though and had never existed. And Boleyn, the Queen of England, the woman who changed the fate of a church and a nation, now sat alone in a stone chamber, accused of the unthinkable, abandoned by the man who once called her my only love. And in the dark silence of her cell, the truth settled like dust. This wasn't about justice. It never had been. It was about removal, and silence, and the execution of a woman who had simply risen too far. It was called a trial, but history remembers it for what it truly was: a performance, a spectacle, a carefully choreographed humiliation, dressed in the robes of justice. And Boleyn, Queen of England, was brought before her peers on May 15, 1536. 2 weeks after her arrest, she stood in the great hall of the Tower, not as a monarch, but as a criminal. Her judges, 26 noblemen, many of whom owed their titles to the very man seeking her death. The king, Henry VIII, would not be present. He did not need to be. The charges were recited like a litany of sins: adultery, treason, incest, with 5 men, one of whom was her own brother, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford. The accusation shook even the ruthless Tudor court. Incest, a taboo so vile it defied not just law but nature. It wasn't just cruel, it was absurd. And it was meant to be. To accuse her of adultery alone would have condemned her. But to stain her with incest was to erase her humanity, to make her unworthy of mourning, unworthy of sympathy. And listened in silence, her face pale but unbroken, her eyes scanning the crowd, not for allies, for there were none, but for truth. But none was offered. The so-called evidence was riddled with impossibilities. Dates when and was proven to be elsewhere. Names drawn from thin air. Fantasies forged in parchment. It didn't matter. The verdict had been written before the trial even began. George Boleyn stood trial as well. A brilliant man, a poet, her brother. He stood accused not just of treason, but of lust for his own sister. It was a cruelty no man could bear, and yet he bore it. When asked about Anne, George refused to betray her, even in the face of death. He held his ground with wit and eloquence. Too much, perhaps. The court found him guilty all the same. His fate was sealed. Anne was given no counsel, no defense, no access to the evidence stacked against her. And yet, when her moment came, she rose. And she spoke. Witnesses recall her words as steady, fierce, and eloquent. She did not plead. She did not crumble. Instead, she addressed the court with the dignity of a queen, denying the charges with such force and clarity that, for a brief moment, the room grew still. Even the most hardened of her enemies were said to have been moved. But the wheels were already in motion. Her words, no matter how sharp, could not cut through the veil of treachery that now hung over her throne. Outside the court, the whispers became laughter. The queen had become a joke, a scandal to be discussed in taverns, in court salons, behind heavy doors. Her enemies gorged themselves on gossip, each rumor more grotesque than the last, each jest sharper than any blade. A woman once exalted as a goddess now served as entertainment. And Boleyn, whose name once sent shudders through Europe, had become punchline, parody, pariah. And yet, within the cold walls of her prison, she remained something else, unbroken. Lady Kingston, who attended her closely, remarked on the strange strength that seemed to possess and during her imprisonment. One moment she wept like a child. The next, she laughed like a woman who had glimpsed something no one else could see. A madness? Or something more dangerous? A clarity. They thought she would scream. She didn't. They expected her to beg. She never did. The verdict? Guilty. The sentence? Death, by burning or beheading, at the king's pleasure. It was over. The trial, the farce, the mask of fairness, all dropped, and was led away. George and the others would go before her. But she would be the final act. And as she walked out of that chamber, condemned and alone, there was no justice left in England, only fear and silence. There is a stillness to death, a quiet so profound it stretches time. And in that final silence, Anne Boleyn found peace, or something that looked like it. She had been sentenced. She had heard the words with her own ears. And now she waited not for mercy, not for rescue, but for the end. She did not scream. She did not beg. She did not sleep. Instead, she sang. Eyewitnesses would later speak of her strange calm. They called it unnatural, otherworldly. She prayed constantly, they said, and when not praying, she laughed. Not from joy, but from something deeper. The kind of laugh that comes from a woman who has seen through the veil of power and understood, finally, how hollow it is. She refused to dress in mourning. Instead, she chose a robe of deep damask red, royal, defiant, unmistakable. A crownless queen, but regal to the last. When asked how she wished to die, by axe or sword, she made a request so unusual, so precise, that it startled even her jailers. A French swordsman. She had heard that the French used a long, two-handed sword, quick, clean, merciful, unlike the English axe, which was often crude, clumsy, and required multiple blows. Her request was granted. Quietly, Henry had already sent for the executioner from Calais days earlier, before her trial had even begun. She was never meant to survive. "Do not weep," she said, "for I am guiltless of what I am accused. I die with a clear conscience." And then she began to give away her belongings. Small trinkets, rosaries, books, not with bitterness, but tenderness, as if she were tucking her legacy into their hands, knowing the world would twist her memory. To one lady, she gave a small prayer book. To another, a handkerchief embroidered with her initials, A.B. "When I am gone," she whispered, "remember me not as queen, but as a woman who loved too boldly and lost too much." At midnight, she made her final confession. Her chaplain later said she was more ready to die than any Christian he had ever known. No fear, no trembling, only fire. Dawn came, and with it her death. But Anne, ever gracious, ever composed, waited longer still. The execution was delayed. The French swordsman had not yet arrived. They told her nothing. She waited. Hours passed. She believed she would be killed at any moment. And yet she endured the terror with terrifying grace. One of her ladies broke down and comforted her. "Peace," she said. "Do not trouble yourself. I have heard that I shall not die until noon, and I am ready." But what does it mean to be ready for death? To know that tomorrow is not a mystery, but a sword waiting with your name on it? Anne Boleyn spent her last night not as a queen, but as a ghost still wearing a crown. A woman whose body still breathed, but whose life had already been erased. Her portrait defaced, her name poisoned, her memory disposable. She had once been the sun around which the world revolved. Now, she was a woman, alone in a tower, waiting for her story to end. May 19th, 1536. It was quiet. Too quiet, some said. The birds did not sing. The crowd did not speak. A strange stillness clung to Tower Green, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Anne Boleyn rose before dawn. She had slept little, if at all. Dressed in a gown of dark gray with a crimson underskirt, she pinned her French hood carefully into her dark hair. The same hair Henry had once kissed, worshipped. The same hair that would now fall with her. She took the hand of one of her ladies and whispered a prayer. Small, gentle, trembling. Then she walked to the scaffold, with the grace of a woman walking to her coronation. No trumpets, no proclamation, no drumbeat, just the whisper of her steps on the scaffold and the quiet sobs of her few remaining attendants. A handkerchief was tucked into her sleeve. Her fingers gripped it like a lifeline. The French swordsman stood to the side, dressed all in black, his weapon hidden in the straw. He had sworn to kill her cleanly. One stroke, no pain, no delay. But it was, and who made it easy? She smiled. She looked to the crowd. Her voice was soft but clear. It did not tremble. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, according to the law, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." Her words were rehearsed, but sincere. She thanked the king, yes, even him, for raising her up, for giving her the crown, for making her queen. And then, in the last moment, she turned inward, away from England, away from Henry, away from the scaffold. "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesu, receive my soul." The executioner stepped behind her, silent, quick, invisible. He had been trained in France, skilled, fast, precise. But he did not tell her he was ready. No final countdown, no dramatic pause. Instead, he did something strange. He whispered, "Where is my sword?" and gestured away from her, and turned her head, instinctively, just slightly. And in that moment, when her neck was stretched, exposed, and unknowing, he struck. The crowd gasped, but no one screamed, no one moved. It had happened so fast that it did not seem real. Some say her lips were still moving seconds after the blade had done its work, that the prayers she whispered as she knelt continued. As her head lay on the scaffold, her eyes wide, her mouth still forming the name of Christ. Whether myth or miracle, the image stayed, burned into the minds of those who witnessed it. Anne Boleyn died without screaming, without weeping, without defiance, but not without power. Her final moments were not a spectacle. They were a testament to her composure, to her silence, to her unbearable grace. And as her body was taken to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula and buried in an unmarked grave beneath the stones, England exhaled. But not all wounds can be buried. She had come to court a bright, laughing girl. She left it headless, nameless, and condemned. But Anne Boleyn's death was not an end. It was a beginning of ghosts. There is a silence that comes after the final breath. Not peace, not relief, just silence. The kind that stretches over stone, over sky, over centuries. On the morning of May 19th, 1536, England entered that silence. The sword had fallen, the body had dropped, and Boleyn, once Queen of England, once the most feared woman in Christendom, lay lifeless in the straw. And in that instant, a kingdom exhaled. The courtiers who had feigned mourning the night before now raised their goblets. They smiled. They whispered. The jokes returned sharp, cruel, effortless. To them it was done. The witch was dead. The king was free. The game could begin again. But outside the court, among the people, it was different. Those who witnessed it firsthand reported something strange. Not triumph, not celebration, but silence. The kind that does not come from respect, but from disbelief. Horror. The crowd had expected a traitor, a monster. But what they saw was a woman. Small, composed, brave. Anne's ladies moved quickly. There was no time to mourn, no time to grieve. Her body, headless and bleeding, was hastily gathered in linen. No coffin had been prepared. No ceremony. No dignity. They placed her in an old arrow chest. Not a royal box. Not a burial casket. A chest once meant for weapons of war, now cradling the broken remains of a queen. She was buried beneath the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. No monument marked her grave. No royal seal. Just cold stones, and the memory of a name no one dared speak aloud. And somewhere, far from the tower, a child was waiting. Elizabeth Tudor was just 2 years old when her mother died. History would later forget that she was born in hope and baptized in splendor. On May 19, 1536, she became something else. The daughter of a disgraced queen. A royal bastard. They took her title. They took her household. They took her mother's portraits down from every wall. Elizabeth would never speak of Anne Boleyn by name, but in her silence, there was memory. And in her reign, there was vengeance. And what of the king? Henry, the man who had rewritten his nation's religion for Anne Boleyn, who had destroyed a queen to make her one, now turned away, cold, calculating. He wore white that day, the color of mourning in France, the color of celebration in England. But no record shows him smiling. He would marry Jane Seymour within 10 days. Yet something shifted that morning, something that would never return. He had broken something more than a woman, more than a marriage. He had broken the divine illusion of kingship. The crowd had seen the blade fall, and now, they would never unsee it. The court moved on. The throne was draped in new silks, but the blood on the scaffold had sunk into the stone, and it would never wash clean. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. And with those words the world turned. The queen was gone, but the ghost she left behind would rule the next age. 11 days, that's all it took. 11 days after Anne Boleyn's body was stuffed into an arrow chest and buried without a name, Henry VIII remarried. Jane Seymour, pale and reserved, took the place and had fought for, bled for, died for. A new queen was crowned. The court rejoiced. The courtiers cheered. The king smiled again. But the silence beneath the surface remained. The 5 men accused alongside and her brother among them were not spared. Their trials, like hers, were mockeries, the outcomes predetermined. They were executed one by one, their names struck from history. Their deaths were quieter, but no less cruel. Mark Smeaton, a court musician, tortured until he confessed to an affair that never happened, died whispering his innocence. George Boleyn, Anne's beloved brother, climbed the scaffold with fire in his voice. The others followed. Heads rolled. England moved on. And the architect of it all rose. Thomas Cromwell, the king's hammer, was richly rewarded. Lands, titles, power. He had orchestrated Anne's fall with surgical precision, stringing together half-truths, jealousies, and ambition into a noose. But the Tower never forgets a face. Just 4 years later, Cromwell too would stand on the scaffold, betrayed by the same king he had served, condemned by the same machinery he had built. His head, like Anne's, rolled on Tower Hill. The executioner's blade bites everyone in time. But it was Elizabeth, Anne's only daughter, who bore the deepest consequence. She was barely a toddler when her mother died, too young to remember the warmth of her arms, the softness of her voice. And yet, she remembered, not in words, but in shadows. Stripped of her title, declared illegitimate, cast out of the royal nursery. For years, Elizabeth lived in the margins. Brilliant, quiet, and watchful. She studied the world that had destroyed her mother, learned its language, mastered its cruelty. And then, she became queen, the Virgin Queen, a woman who would never marry, never surrender power to any man. Her mother's fate whispered to her from the grave, "Love is not safe. Queens are not safe." She ruled with iron, with fire, with memory, and though she rarely spoke of Anne, the blood they shared ruled England for 44 years. Anne Boleyn had been called a whore, a witch, a traitor, but her daughter became a legend, and that legend rewrote history. Today, few believe Anne was guilty. The evidence, even then, was paper-thin. No witnesses, no motive, just the whispers of power. Most historians now accept the truth. She was destroyed not by proof, but by politics, by men who feared her, by a husband who tired of her. And Boleyn died because she was clever, because she was ambitious, because she was bold in a world that demanded obedience, and because she gave birth to a daughter instead of a son. But history has a long memory, and Anne's ghost has never truly left the Tower. History is a storyteller that loves to forget the quiet moments, the moments that have no drumbeat, no trumpets, no chorus of voices to mark their passing. We remember battles and coronations, treaties and triumphs. But what of the sound of a sword as it cuts through the stillness? The final, sharp crack of steel against bone and breath. And Boleyn's last breath is not recorded in the grand annals of kings and queens. There is no royal scroll that captures the moment when her life slipped away. But that breath, that fragile, fading breath, still echoes through the stones of the Tower. It haunts the cold air, lingering like a whispered warning to those who seek power at any cost. Anne was not a traitor, not a whore, not a monster, as her enemies tried to paint her. She was a woman caught in the merciless machinery of ambition and fear. She was a queen who dared to dream beyond the confines of her time, who spoke truth to kings, who demanded to be seen as more than a pawn in a deadly game. And that was her crime. She was inconvenient, a threat to those who wielded power in shadows. Her blood, spilled on Tower Green, watered the roots of a kingdom that would become an empire built on the bones of those who fell too soon. Her ghost still walks here, not as a wailing spirit, but as a silent witness. A reminder that history's greatest stories are often written in blood and silence. The girl who smiled as the blade fell, the woman who faced death with grace, lives on in the shadows of the Tower. She is a warning, a memory, a queen undone by power and immortalized by her courage. We remember Anne Boleyn, not for the crime she never truly committed, but for the strength she showed in the face of oblivion, for the daughter she left behind, for the empire she unwittingly helped forge. In the end, history is not just what was written by kings or conquered by swords. It is also the quiet breath of those who dared to live and die on their own terms.